on Drupal.org. You can find me at Texel. I maintain CRM Core. I maintain a couple of other modules. I really believe that people who run technology companies should know something about technology, which is what makes me cool. And then I'm also the father of 2 kids, and I have a dog. Blake, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Blake Maples. I'm an account executive here at Trellon. I switched over from the music industry and have been working in sales, and I'm the proud godfather of a wonderful kitten and a lazy millennial, as I read.
Thanks, Blake. I'm Jake Tuman. I'm a project manager here at Trellon. I'm from San Diego originally. You can find me at JWTuman on Twitter, IRC, and Drupal.org, and I'm excited to say this is my 3rd DrupalCon.
Very cool. Together, the 3 of us today are going to talk a little bit about Agile development techniques. We're going to talk about this from the perspective of being a company that is trying to implement Agile processes. I would love to just see a show of hands here. Who works for a web development firm? Maybe not an agency, but some group looking to implement Agile. Can I see a show of hands? Okay, I think that's about 40% of the room by a quick count. I think you're going to find that we have some very practical techniques and some very practical approaches to talk about here today. The very first thing we're going to talk about really is implementing Agile. Okay, what goes into that? Why people think about it? But we're going to look at it in terms of some of the challenges that exist. Secondly, we're going to talk about where to start. I think every long road starts with a first step, and we're going to make some suggestions about kind of where to consider putting that first foot. Third, we're going to talk about how Agile fits into our sales process. We have it vertically integrated into everything that we do. And so we'll show off some of the techniques that we use in order to get Agile going even before a project starts. Next, we'll talk a little bit about from the design perspective. That's really where I'll jump in. And just try and illustrate how Agile happens, okay? Because for a lot of folks, they have trouble visualizing like where to start having conversations about user stories and things. And so we'll lay some of that out and hopefully lend some clarity. And then finally, we're going to talk about it from the development phase. Okay, when does Agile come into what we're doing? How do we do sprints? And how do we stick with our scrums? But first, to roll it all back, let's talk a little bit about implementing Agile. Okay, implementing Agile within an organization. Trellon is our company. It's 10 years old. We've been involved in the community since God knows when. And over the last 10 years, we've had a lot of time to try and perfect our project management processes. It's really been over the last 3 years that we've been making a strong push to move towards Agile. We have an existing development process that's been in place forever. It is effective, in answering some of the common challenges that we have. But at the same time, getting to the point where stakeholders outside our organization, developers, designers, are all on the same page has really been like the holy grail for us. Having an efficient and convenient way to move between different phases of projects where people are really bought in and excited about what they're doing, I think is what every development process should be structured like. So we had to look at Agile. We had to really think to ourselves, what are the things that we're looking to accomplish here? We find that it helps to start with some definitions. But there's a lot of words to learn. Some of the, common terms that come up very often are listed here. What we found is that as you went from a project manager to a director to a technical lead to a lead developer to a designer, all of these terms had very different meanings. Even after we had sent people to trainings, they would come in and talk about what a sprint is, what a backlog is, what burn rate really means. And it wouldn't be a universal definition that everybody adhered to. So an organizational challenge that we really faced was, trying to get everybody on the same page about what this is. Another option that a lot of folks have is to go out and get some training, which takes time to implement. Most shops that are looking to implement Agile aren't necessarily looking to just jump in with both feet. They're not necessarily looking to send people off to extensive training courses. What they're looking for is very practical ways of getting started that have a demonstrable impact that can be measured, in the near term, in 6 months to a year. Not necessarily one that takes a large investment in order to switch over to. So we had sent a few people to get certifications with Scrum Alliance. It worked out okay. Those people quickly found jobs at other companies because now they were certified product owners. And, there's other sides that go along to it. So how do you find a balance? For Trellon, what we really tried to do is focus on integrating Agile development techniques, not just in the development process, but within our sales process, within our design process, and then also in our coding. And that was hard. Okay, I wouldn't say it's like NP level hard, but when you have a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas about what things mean, there tends to be a lot of confusion. Instead of working on a project, there's a lot of discussion about some abstract concept about how to work on a project all of a sudden. And it takes time for the dust to settle, and that's normal. That's what should happen. At the end of this road, it led to a lot of improvements and outcomes. Okay, we were able to finally start making promises that, if it's going to take us 6 months to get a project done, we would really deliver within 6 months. Things wouldn't get stretched out. If we're saying that it's going to cost $100,000 to do something, we're not suddenly charging you $120,000. Okay, and then finally, that the quality of the project, what we actually build, reflects what you intended at the start. There's not some feature missing that's suddenly getting pushed to a phantom phase 2 that doesn't exist yet. These were the kinds of outcomes that we were seeing across the board as we started getting deeper and deeper into using some of the techniques we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But there's one big outcome that really does matter. And with all of the other ones, we can still get away with it if we slip in one of those areas. But happiness is kind of the key outcome that I like to see. People should really love what's being built. If you're doing Agile right, what happens is you see people's hopes, their aspirations, their ideas for their applications being expressed in a much more meaningful way that they can understand when you get to the end of a project. These are some letters that I got recently, and I'm not doing this as like an advertisement, but I think our clients actually say it the best and much better than I ever could. Having a perfect delivery on this was very real for us, and I'm delighted Trellon again came through with the goods. You guys are in danger of making it look easy, but I know it's not. We get to the level of predictability where we can say, look, we're going to do this at a certain level and it's going to cost so much, and it's going to be done at a certain time, and that's the kind of reaction you get from folks when they actually see it happening. You got an exceptional amount done in a very tiny time window. I've said it before, but your project managers are great communicators. One of the other sort of tangible affects that we've seen is since we've really switched over to Agile, everybody thinks we are the greatest communicators on earth. I don't put us too far above or too far below anybody. I think we're not mediocre, but it does create an impression relative to other people folks have worked with that you're really on the ball at all times. So a useful perspective on where to start. For me, it's always the way I like to think about Agile, and the way I tell my team to think about Agile is really that we are telling a story about a system, and we're carrying it out. And we're carrying out the plans for how to build it. So when we can get away from the idea that there is like a technique to this, and we can really just boil it down to the simplest form, this is what you can't do without and still say you have an Agile process, is that you're telling a story and you're putting the plans in place for how you're going to build it. What we really started with, our first practical steps that we implemented into all of the stages of our company processes is really the idea of user stories, okay? They give us a basis to understand what needs to be done. They give us a basis to understand how much work goes in to making it happen. And they also give us a basis for testing the outcomes. When we're done with development, how do we judge what it is that we've actually done? And that's what user stories give us. So for anybody who's unfamiliar, I'm sure a crowd this large, most folks probably have a good sense of it. But with each story, there is a construction to it, and we stick with a very formal construction. Every story has a perspective. We'll say, as an authenticated user, as an administrator, as someone else. But we're always saying where the story comes from, who this is attached to, who we're worried about, when we put this down. Each story also has a requirement. That story has to say that there's something this person can do when they're in the system. Okay, I should be able to change my password. Each story also has a justification. That justification is what communicates the business value of it. And you could have a story that explains how to do something without that, but what it makes sure of is that your business stakeholders and your developers always understand things and see things eye to eye. It lends greater context to everything that comes subsequent. Once we got through user stories, once we got to the point where people could grasp user stories, where a designer and a developer could write it, and our clients could tolerate us when we were trying to put them together because there were a lot of awkward steps in that direction, we moved on to points. We use points to measure everything, okay, to measure work effort, to measure business priority. Those are the common ones we use in the planning stage. But then also to measure the response from focus groups. We might be done with a design. We might be testing a design to understand how effective it is. We will actually use points built around user stories to do that. And then also to assess outcomes at the end of a project. We might want to understand how well our work matches up with the business value that was expected at the initiation of a project, and so we'll use points there. Points are weird things. You know, you want to apply them in a way that is contextually relevant to a project, but you don't want people's kind of preconceptions to creep in. We use something called a Fibonacci scale. You see it depicted here, and it's just a relative scale, okay? You know, how much work effort is required? How valuable is this compared to other requirements in your system? Depending on the question being asked, it can be a really useful tool. What we really like about it is that the answers that people give are relative within that project. Maybe a password reset feature has a business value of 1 in one site because there's a lot of users who need to reset well, rather there aren't many people who need to reset their passwords. And maybe it's an 89 in another one. Maybe it's a giant community and they don't want administrators to ever have to go back and change a password. The Fibonacci scale actually allows us to kind of stay in on that. One thing about points, and this is something we kind of treat as a truth, is anytime we're going to collect points, we don't do it from just one person. We're not interested in one person's perspective. We try to shoot for a minimum of 3. We try to shoot for no more than 7. And there's a little bit of research on the upper side of that scale that says you tend to get less relevant results when you have larger groups. But on the lower side of the scale, what it is we just don't want one person's perspective to predominate a conversation. And that's why we're always pulling together teams in order to help evaluate whatever it is that we're measuring. After we got through user stories, after we started creating points for everything, looking for those nexus between development effort and business value, we got very serious about sprints and structuring the work output of our team to make sure that any time a developer is working on code, it's part of a plan where we've sized it and we can make sure that things are going to get done in a structured way. Every time we have a sprint, what we do is we prioritize those sprints themselves around the things with the greatest business value. This keeps us from risking letting critical path items fall off of our development schedule, right? We can always make sure we're hitting the high notes first. What sprints also allow us to do is to keep development from getting out of control. Anytime we create a task that is part of a sprint, what we do is we make sure it won't take more than a week. If it has the potential to, we break it into more than one task. And the reason is just we want to have predictable, measurable results at all times. That's been kind of a game changer for us. The way sprints and user stories intersect, and this is what a lot of people, I think, sort of miss when they think about how all this goes together, is that each user story goes into a sprint. If you collect 100 user stories, maybe you break it up 10 by 10 and suddenly it's 10 sprints, but more likely what's going to happen is you're going to organize them thematically into something called a saga. And a saga is, this is the way we describe it to clients sometimes, is it's the story of a user's journey through your site. It simply talks about one kind of set of actions you want people to do, or one set of things you want them to take away when they've come and experienced what you have to offer. Part of what we do with sprints is we're constantly verifying and assessing what we've done. So we can involve stakeholders in the sprints, every single day when we're reviewing our work and doing check-ins. But most often what happens is we have a shared desktop, and at the end of the week, we're logging in, demonstrating the way you would click through things, providing a little bit of training on how it would work. And it's incredibly useful for us to do that because we're just collecting unbiased kind of impressions. Does this work well enough for me? Is this the thing that I would like to be using? An incredibly useful tool for all this is join.me. We'll just get a shared desktop going. We'll get as many people into it as feel like they need to be there, and we'll start showing off what's going on. At that point, we have this opportunity, right, where we can stop being those experts on the phone with you, and we can start being those people who are just other users, just like you, and we can talk frankly about what's going on. It tends to lead to better outcomes when we can get stuff down to that level. One of the other things about sprints, and I just want to quickly make that point, is that they're always time limited. We never go over 2 weeks on any sprint. Like I said, it has the potential for things to get out of control. But really, there's other reasons for that, too. If you've got like 50 stories lined up, okay, and you fail on 3 or 4 of them, that's better than failing on 1 out of 10, isn't it? Like from a points perspective. Any time you can quantify developmental measures and say to ourselves, we've got pass-fail on this number of things, it's just a more structured way of communicating. And that's one of the big reasons that we use time limits on all of our sprints. So some of the side effects, and this is just kind of to summarize what 3 of the very practical techniques are that we think people ought to be considering in order to get started. Really, a transparency. The idea that your client knows as much as you do about your application at all times, and also about the plans for what's going to happen next. You want business stakeholders and developers really to have that same level of understanding. One of the things I've always hated is the idea that, because I have a technical perspective on something, my clients don't have a clue what it is that I'm talking about, and they're kind of trying to tune me out. Agile development techniques help us to get past that real quick. Predictability. We really like knowing how much things are going to cost and when they're going to get done. So do most folks. When we can get to that point where we're making claims and we're delivering on them, that gives this whole other kind of perspective into the things that is that we do. And it really plays into those feelings of satisfaction that I was talking about. And then finally, insight. One of the big challenges that I've had with Trellon over the years is the idea that, hey, why did this thing break? I asked 5 different people. All of them worked on it. None of them know why it's broken. It's really hard in the midst of the development process to get to some of those answers sometimes. I'm not saying that I have the answer to everything, but probably 4 out of 5 times when I go to ask a question about what's going on, I can track it back to a user story. I can track it back to a sprint. We can find a way to deal even with really complex regression errors simply by looking back at our process and looking at the way these stories unfolded. It's a whole different perspective to development. I'm going to back off, and my good friend Blake here is going to talk about the sales process.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to talk a bit about the sales process and using Agile techniques even at that early stage of development. So using sizing to scope a project. You want to know that you're not losing money on a deal. And, since we've been implementing this process, I'd say, 9 out of 10 of the projects that I've brought on have operated at a profit. It creates transparency about the work that will be done. You understand the time and effort needed. And so you're really empowering your developers. You're empowering your clients. You're empowering yourself as a salesperson. And you're keeping everyone happy as much as humanly possible. Everyone is involved. And that's what's really cool about this process. You don't have to be a genius to use it. I switched industries into technology, and it was very intimidating at first because a client asks for something and you want to make them happy, but then your developers are very upset with you or me for promising these things at a certain price level. And so this gets everyone involved, and there's really two sides to it. There's the sales side, the account executive, me, and then there's the developers. And whereas what Mike and what Jake will talk about, it has a few more people involved with the process. With me, it starts with collecting requirements from a very high level. So meeting with clients, discovering what they need, and collecting questions from the developers. So I bring the list to the developers, and they'll ask me more in-depth questions like, how are we actually going to get this done? And from there, I'll itemize the things that need to be done and put them in a list, in a spreadsheet, and I'll hop on. So we're dealing with some third-party integration with a nonprofit recently, and I really didn't know much about this type of integration, and so we went around, we collect comparative design compositions to understand the user interface requirements. And in that process, the developers evaluate each requirement. They point out gaps and things that I might not have thought about, and they provide relative levels of effort required to complete the work. So really, it's just a process of empowerment. Any employee at Trellon has a support system or a safety net almost, so you're not going to overpromise something. And with that, you know what needs to be done, and you know that you're not operating at a loss. And I'm going to hand it over to Mike to discuss the design process.
Thanks. So to paint a little bit of a picture here, when, let's say a project has been closed on, we have these sort of proto-stories that come over that were used to create, sizing for us to estimate the number of hours it will take to do certain things. And at that stage, we're kind of reading through them and we're thinking about what they mean and asking some initial questions during kickoff meetings. But then things kind of get real serious. With my designers, some of the guys who work for us who do a lot of the planning, we get a lot of questions about when would I create a user story? When is it appropriate to get started? And I see a lot of hesitancy that happens. And the reason is that designers tend to be visual people more so than word people. They might use words for emphasis, but at the same time, they don't really focus on putting things down. So I've taken kind of a militant answer all the time. If you want to know when to create user stories, that should be the first thing you do. It should be done in parallel with everything else that you're trying to handle. I really think user stories complement wireframes naturally. And I put these two graphics up there to kind of try and illustrate some points. If you look off on the right, that's a wireframe, right? We add annotations to wireframes. Those annotations naturally can become user stories. Not just because, they're there, okay? But annotations tend to, let's just say, explain some of the intricacies of a design. And they tend to be the sorts of things that developers really need to know about. Like, what happens when I click that button? How does the interactivity occur? So what we always say is that they go hand in hand. Annotations from a wireframe should always be reflecting user stories. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have other user stories, right? But it's kind of a nice visual for getting the picture in your mind for how they make their way from one side to the other. So how do I organize user stories? Okay, for a lot of us, we have wireframing processes where maybe there's a home page, there's a bunch of landing pages. We've already spelled them out for how they're going to do. The one big change that we've kind of had to have is to tell people to organize them into sagas. Describe what it's like to go through 4 or 5 pages that are part of the registration process. Make sure that we've iterated that story before we move on. That's the only part that's really required a change in thinking for our developers, is the idea that you want to make your way to some endpoint before you move on and try to normalize everything else. It's kind of had let's say, a big impact from another perspective, and that's of the stakeholder. The idea that they can look at multiple pages in this arc that are coming together, and they can make sure that those things are consistent, rather than just focusing on a set of disconnected, landing pages. So how do I share user stories? Okay, one of my goals always is to make sure that our clients are participating in the construction of stories. My degrees were in English and philosophy. I think I'm a pretty well-spoken person. But when I'm sharing user stories with a client, I'm constantly being corrected. Nothing I can say is good enough. There's days where it feels like that. And the reason is that this is the story of something that they care very much about. There's a very specific way that they want things stated. When you can start putting stories in front of them that just aligns you with what they're expecting, which is a good thing. And maybe in the first time you sit down to do it, that's kind of rough, right? But the third or the fourth time, you're using the same language as them. Expectations have been adjusted on both sides. And so that's a way of getting on the same page, which is usually a little bit more effective than other ways of doing things. So I put, just in terms of decreasing importance, a list of the things that we usually do. So a shared desktop, literally sitting down, writing stories together is the most effective process we have. It's one we use all the time. Shared spreadsheets is really the number two. The idea that you could take a spreadsheet that I've been working on, pick up on my stories, start writing them yourselves. We can track the changes and see what the other one has done. That's a big deal. Third is wikis. I don't like wikis as much just because they don't have a forced structure. You can kind of do anything. Our stories tend to become bizarre for folks who don't have experience with that format over time. But yeah, they can be effective tools. And then sometimes doing it in front of a group can be effective. I simply do that the least because we visit our clients' offices a lot less frequently than we do the other things. But sometimes I'll have a group of 10 to 15 stakeholders, and people are offering perspectives on certain parts of the system. That's a good way to make sure you get those right. And then finally, email and downloadable documents. Sometimes people ask me to email them my user stories. I try to cheat. I try to tell them, no, I can't download those. There's no way. You have to use the shared documents. But that's just how it is. So a common objection I get from designers, like what they grouse about when I say, look, we're doing user stories, they'll say it takes a lot more time. And I'll say, yeah, at first it does. But we always make up for it in terms of development. By the time we get to where we're building things out, we've got this huge backlog with all of these stories, and developers can go to town on it. Developers having to do less research is a lot cheaper than having designers put together their notes in a structured format. Those animations got messed up. Another common outcome that we have is, another thing people are worrying about is how do we hand them off to developers? And the answer really is you don't. You should be involving project managers at that stage during design, getting them to size stories, getting them to do some of the planning way ahead of time before it's time to start working on stuff. When you're able to do that, your backlog is completely sized. You can literally jump to development, okay? Once you start getting near the end of design. We tend to shoot for 90% design, meaning we've got 90% of our design deliverables in place prior to starting to hand things off to developers, really. But, again, with great communication and project management, that's usually a pretty easy process. So, would you like to go?
So now we get to the fun part. I'm going to see how far my voice projects, but Mike did a good job of kind of giving us an overall sort of bird's eye view of the Agile process and how Trellin has adopted it. Blake did a good job of explaining that it does start with the sales process all the way till the end of the process. But we're really here at this point because of this, development. So let's prepare to set our phasers to stun. Sizing the user stories is really the most important part. As project manager, I get this very long list of user stories, or backlog, if you will. And my goal right away as project manager is to identify any faulty user stories. These are basically user stories that I don't think are defined well enough, maybe a little bit too big, or just need more definition. So at that point, I take it back to the clients and or developers and try to help them understand how can we cut this down? How can we make this more digestible? And the purpose of doing that is just so that everyone's on the same page and we're not trying to introduce a user story to the process that's really just too big to handle in a sprint. That's really grooming the backlog is what we call it. On the other side is I actually as a project manager only, I do not show my developers, is there's a business value assigned to each user story. And this goes back to that Fibonacci scale that we were talking about earlier. And this is done by the clients. They go from 0 all the way up to epic. That helps me as a project manager know what's really the important features that we want to accomplish in this project, but also to help me prioritize which ones we should focus on first. So at that point, we get to something called user poker at Trellin. And this is actually, the purpose of user poker is really just to have some fun. I like to have 2 to 3 developers together with me. And ideally, the reason is just to have a really broad spectrum of kind of how developers might think of a user story and how they might evaluate it. And I actually keep it really simple. I use a Google Doc, and in column A, I leave blank. Column B, C, and D, I put the developer's name. And then what happens is that I take each user story, I plop it into column A, and I say it out loud. Developers hear it, they kind of digest it a little bit, and then I go 3, 2, 1, go. And each one of those developers in their column put in their Fibonacci scale, sort of how they rate it as far as effort. At that point, it becomes really fun because you get to see how different developers sort of rate on effort a user story and kind of help understand how we can come to a sort of consensus, decide what is the actual effort required for this user story. So this is a process we use quite a bit at Trellin. We find that's very fun and effective of really finding out what is the pure value of how to use a user story and what does it require as effort. And again, these are points on effort, not on time. After we've done the user stories poker, and we've got basically our backlog now of our business value and our now user story effort value, we begin to sprint. And I think we all kind of know what sprint is. Mike touched on it a little bit. It's just a period of time in which we actually start development. All sprints start off with a kickoff, and that's where we include the clients, myself, and the developers to kind of get out any sort of last-minute clarification that might be required on our user stories. We also, at that point, identify, based upon business value and where the user story efforts intersect, to decide a total amount of effort points that we want to assign for the sprint. Sometimes it's 100, sometimes it's 200, but what this eventually becomes is our burn down rate. So after assigning our points to a sprint, we basically begin the sprint. And again, we try not to do sprints more than 2 weeks. I like a week. But each day during the sprint, I do a scrum. And I think everyone here kind of understands how a scrum works. I take 15 minutes, no more and no less. And then I ask, what did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? And then are there any obstacles? If at any point in time during the scrum I feel like a developer is getting a little bit too sort of technical, I stop them right there. We move on. We say, that's a tech huddle. So after a scrum, either right afterwards or later in the day, I'll have a tech huddle where we can get a little bit more involved, share screens, and kind of figure out what is it the developer's trying to accomplish and seeing how we can fix it. My actually favorite part of Agile is during a sprint, I really don't get any client involvement. It's pretty clear what we're doing. The expectations are set. So they can't really inject any of their requirements or concerns during that sprint. And that's pretty much a benefit for a project manager. After a sprint is complete, I then looked at the burn down rate, again, back to the user stories, how many of those points were completed in that time period. During that time also, I do a client demo for review, and I point and click and decide, do you accept this or do you not? And if they accept it, great, remove it from the backlog. If they don't, we add it back to the backlog for the purpose of potentially adding it to a new sprint. And then again, we just go through that process over and over. It's pretty straightforward, nothing too fancy about it. So with that being said, thank you for all your time, and any questions?
Okay, we got through things a little bit faster maybe than what we thought, but yeah, we'd love to talk.
I'm just curious, you had the Google Doc, the spreadsheet with the stories, and I guess you also have the history. It would be useful for me, because I think what you guys are doing is very smart. Would it be possible to see like an old stories document? Like, would you be able to share something like that?
I think so.
Nothing proprietary, but it's just something that I could see what the columns look like and what a story looks like and
Yeah.
how much depth you go into it.
I'll put one up that we can kind of look at, and if anybody has any specific questions about it, this is a screenshot of the one that I did. And it's for a website that we're working on currently.
Can you repeat that question? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
just so everybody knows, what he was asking is, can I show a sample, chart for tracking user stories? It might actually help us if anybody does have questions. We have a microphone there, in the back of the room. Maybe just feel free to get up and line up. That way we'll make sure everybody hears. But yeah, that's what it looks like. And usually there's 100 or so. You'll see on this one we've actually rated business value and technical effort, using some of those scales. This is what it actually looks like when we start putting those things together. What we're always looking for is high business value, low technical effort. That's how you rate a great story. That's one of the ones you want to include in your first sprints, because then you're setting yourself up for success. When you find ones that have low value, well, even high value and high effort, you want to wait if you can. So, but that's what one of these sheets looks like, and I don't know if I can scale out, but hopefully it helps. Next question?
Could you talk about the process you've gone through and how the scoring, the efforts values have improved, or did you get it right from the first time? And determining the sprints, like how much you can include in a sprint.
Yeah. What I'd say is the process we went through to get this implemented was an organizational shift of a very high order. I had good friends who had been working with me for a very long time, and for many of them I had to help them move on, to roles in other companies because they weren't getting it and they were never going to get it. You have to have good leadership to have good Agile processes. That's what I think. You have to have people who are not going to rush to build stuff. You just don't really get anywhere there. Everything has to be a little bit measured, and that's a second reaction to some folks. So I would say our shift towards Agile started close to 3 years ago. I'd say we started seeing results roughly a year ago, and it was very painful at times. But again, I think it's very satisfying when you start to see the outcomes. And, just leave it at that. What other questions?
All lining up.
Okay, so the question is, with billing and documentation, what's different around a normal client? The answer is nothing. Most of our work is done on a time and materials basis. We bill, a certain number of dollars an hour for what we do, so it's the same. It's just that our billing tends to be very accurate at this point. It's very rare that we go over or come in less than 10% off of where we were originally. So we're going to switch to just the questions at the mic.
So this goes back to the sales part of it. When you're going through all of that exercise of estimating, are you actually doing that as a paid discovery phase? Are you actually getting some sort of request, a proposal, and you're going through all that effort? Because I know how much effort that takes.
Yeah.
So where are you doing that? And because then you're having to come up with kind of a fixed bid
Right.
usually. So
That
tell
is
us a little bit more about that, because that, to me, is really the mystery behind all of this.
Yeah. It's not part of the paid discovery phase, but it's when we're trying to scope it all out. It's the very initial phases and the initial discussions with the client, and it's not as involved as the development sizing exercises. It's a matter of sitting down, grabbing a couple developers, and making sure that we're not over-promising anything.
Just remember, we've got some pretty bright guys on our team. So it's never that much effort for us to have to go through something like this. If we know that there's a part of it that we're not going to get right without that, we will include our own paid development cycle or discovery cycle as part of a proposal.
Like if you're trying to create an API to some system that you don't know or something like that.
So another common thing that we'll do is we'll say, look, you have up to 100 hours of time that will be spent on this, or we're going to do up to 8 wireframes. We'll build logical separators in just to give ourselves some protections. Building boundaries and having constraints is a great thing, and when people understand them, they get very creative about how to work within them, and it just leads places that people wouldn't if they thought it's a buffet. So that's kind of why we do it that way.
Great, thanks.
Hi, thank you for sharing. We've been implementing Agile for a while, and we've noticed that design and specs creation, like UX design and stuff like that, really blocks our way when we're trying to apply that with Agile. So we've kind of moved it away from the Agile process, and we're making it before we start the sprints for code. So my question is, do you guys do anything to get design work and design spec for usability with Agile, or is it just the development part?
Absolutely, the two things happen hand in hand. I don't think you can build a great site unless you have a great design process. I can totally understand some organizations struggle with the idea of doing Agile during design, or that UX can happen before you're actually building clickable prototypes and things, right? It's really hard to assess an experience at that stage. So the way we approach it is that we're going to create user stories in parallel with wireframes. What that does is it kind of sets the stage so that our mock-ups later on are going to be a little bit more informed. We'll be spending a little less time on those. When we get to the point where we're actually building the interfaces, if we were to find that, hey, we completely got it wrong, it's ugly, yeah, that's a potential outcome, but that's never happened. And what we see is the opposite. Clients just kind of know what's going on. We tend to be thinking down the road of being a partner where we really understand what the outcomes are that they seek at the end. And so just given the fact that there's a lot of folks who are thinking down the same track because we're building these user stories, that tends to solve a few usability issues long before we even get to development. So yeah, that's how we do. But we don't consider that a blocker. That's not hard for us.
Yeah, I was just curious, when you have a user story or more than one user story, they get in progress and then inevitably takes a lot longer than you expect, doesn't get completed within the sprint. What sort of mechanism do you use? Do you just roll it to the next sprint, or what do you do?
Yeah, generally, it's a time period, right? So if it's not done, that's really just an indication of maybe either the effort points weren't assigned correctly, or maybe we need to add more effort points in a sprint. But generally, if it doesn't get completed, that's it. Pencils down. You got to put it back in the backlog and then decide if you want to add it to the next sprint.
Thank you.
Hi there. As a consultant sort of walking into a client that wants to do Agile sprints, can you talk a little to the idea of sort of evolving into the process versus, hey, we're ready, we want to start, we just bought Jira, sprint zeros tomorrow, go?
Oh. That's a threatening sounding situation in a way. So the way I would answer it is just to say, look, everybody gets someplace, right? We don't all start off perfect. And that goes with our processes as well as our relationships we build with people. And, some of the clients Trellon's been working with for 6 or 7 years now, it started horribly. Something god-awful happened in the first that cost them money, embarrassed us, threats of lawsuits and stuff. But over time, we kind of learned to work together and keep things going. I'll just say that experience is a teacher. And when you walk in on a first day and, folks are ready to go, you just try your hardest. And if it doesn't work, you try again. Okay, and I don't think it's any more complex than that, right? One of the things I tell folks on our team all the time is just remember to swing the bat. You can't just push this aside for a few months and then hope you're going to catch up on it. I will notice and make you feel guilty. But before it even gets anywhere, it's just try. That's 50% of implementing the practice.
This question is regarding team dynamics. You have a team, and invariably there's developers that can do a lot more points than others. And let's say that developer maybe is on vacation. Your burn down chart doesn't quite affect the reality of it. What kind of tips have you guys experienced, perhaps, that you can share that to deal with such situations?
Biggest variances that we see are actually generational. I don't mean to sound weird about it, but Gen X developers do things a different way than millennial developers. Okay. What you tend to find is that the kinds of solutions people will want to implement are greatly influenced by what they've seen in the past. And it's really true. There's generations to technology. and the solutions people may have implemented a long time ago, like write a query, might be very different these days. Use Drupal's database abstraction layer and put something else in. So where we see the biggest variances is in stuff like that, when you have a different style of programmer coming in. We don't really do vacations at Trellin, so that's never. Our guys are pretty tough.
There's the 80-20 rule. You have 20% of your developers do 80% of their work, and when they're not there, to kind of get that.
Yeah.
My other question is, do you, as a rule, or maybe high point stories, you should break up into smaller story points for at least for a given sprint, or it's just you can assign a 12 or 21 to somebody if that's a recommended practice?
We have a designation for something that must be broken down, and it's epic. And I learned this from my good friend Zach, who works for some giant university. And anytime we get to the point where something's epic, it must be broken, and we don't care. It's just automatically. It's like accusing somebody of being Hitler in a IRC forum. Just conversation over, let's move. So that's our designation. And basically epic would mean over 2 weeks.
So there's a relationship between points and time eventually.
Kind of. We're just saying once you get into a gray area, that's it.
If there's any ambiguity whatsoever, you have to break it down. It has to be in digestible chunks and sort of put into a situation where if a developer can't deal with it in 2 weeks, then we have to rethink how that user story works, or that user story becomes a saga, if you really think about it. And at that point, you're breaking down user stories below that saga.
This is sort of building on the design side of things for Agile. We're experimenting with options where we do everything using some sort of Agile framework, even content inventory and audit, content strategy, modeling. We haven't looked at assigning points necessarily for effort or value. Is that something that you've done throughout this whole process for the design for the UX side of things?
Yeah. So kind of going back to this wireframe, user stories and wireframes go hand in hand. If you look real carefully at that spreadsheet, you'll see the technical complexities there. Mm-hmm. That's development effort, and usually we'll assign business value as well. It's just that we do it sporadically when we're at the design stage.
Okay.
In other words, we're not going to have a project manager formally sizing every story within X number of hours or something. What we're going to have is us reaching certain points and saying, look, let's sit down and size this first, because we might be getting to the point where things are way out of hand. That's really just an awareness, okay, of what needs to be there. Now, we have other parts of our process that, this doesn't cover, like, content type audit and user role audit. But a lot of that kind of emerges from what we've done with stories. By the time we have wireframes and by the time we have user stories in place, that's 80% of that's mapped out already anyway. So we don't necessarily need to think about those as budget centers.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Thanks.
Cool.
I saw in your spreadsheet that you have, for the business value, 1 and then 50 and then 100. You don't really go in between those three settings, it looked like. Is that a common thing? Well, low, medium, high, pretty much?
Well, yeah. Let's just remember it's all relative. And you could use any scale. Low, medium, high, or fine. We tend to stick with a Fibonacci scale. The only times we try to break from it are when a client starts spouting off numbers. I want a 73. We can't account for that, but it means something to them. And as long as it means something to the person who's saying it, hopefully they can remember the difference between a 73 and a 69. But that's what it is. It doesn't have to mean anything outside of that context.
Do you find yourself using these numbers at the end of the day as an evaluation tool of your own employees?
No, that'd be cruel. So, I don't know. They could talk about what evaluation cycles are, but that has nothing to do with Agile.
Oh, okay. Well, one other question. Never mind.
That's okay.
Hi. Okay, so with the spreadsheet, I was just getting a little lost between the spreadsheet and the wireframes. Is it that these are grouped. Like, actually, if you go back to the spreadsheet, I was looking at that and I wasn't seeing how I would turn that into a wireframe. Is it that create a booking stories, that's a page, and this is all the content that's going to go on the create a booking page?
Well, where it says like booking stream story, we consider that a saga. The saga, again, is that detailed journal of a user's experience as they go through your site. And we call them a saga to imply that, there's some traveling going on, right? So with every saga, you could kind of think of it that way. Like a saga could be about a single page and describes the interaction that's going to happen on it, and other things. But the relationship is tenuous at best, right? There's sometimes when you have like a chicken and the egg problem. Should I draw it first? Should I write up the stories for it first? All I know is that, after a day or two, you ought to have some user stories and you ought to have some wireframes. So one does not have to precede the other. It's just they can't really exist without each other. The one requirement that we really have for designers is just there better be some annotations. I don't want to see black and white drawings that nobody can explain. If somebody gets into a meeting and they're like, oh, well, I don't even know I did that. I never want to hear that. That implies you don't have a plan. And that's what we do is we think and we plan. That's what design is.
Okay, thanks.
I'm intrigued by the idea of that using Agile for the design aspect of it before you start development. But I was just wondering, how would you handle technical requirements, before you start developing, such as custom integrations with external systems? How would you capture that kind of information as part of your Agile process?
So, you can take it. Okay. I can answer that a few ways. From the sales perspective, we recently had a client come and say, integrate our site with this third-party platform. They have an API. Just do it. Tell us how much work is involved. So I made Blake answer that. And I kind of knew the answer because I was able to read the API, but I wanted to see how he would run with that ball. And so he set up a meeting. We itemized like the high-level requirements, like the user logs in, they're logged into this other thing. The user can easily go over from one system to the other. We can display the scores of the user. The user always has an account, blah, blah, blah. And we sat down with developers to size it. And developers, of course, immediately pointed out the gaps. And then they sat down, they looked at the API. Unfortunately, it was a well-defined API, so it wasn't like the hardest thing on earth. And that's how we came up with a size. And a size communicates cost and time to do it. That's what was going to be needed. Now, the second thing I would answer is, there's another part to our process. It's called core configuration, where we look at a Drupal site. We've got this list of like 150 or so best practices that we follow. And we would use that really to determine, do we need a custom module? Can it be handled a different way? What are the other cool things that could happen? And by, sort of focusing at that level, okay, we're also able to sort of like make this harmonious decision, right, about how would that fit in with everything else that we have going on. So with core configuration, it's part decision-making tool and part documenting. And that makes it pretty easy for us to understand if there's other Drupal modules that could be used, or maybe we use the services module to handle some of the authentication and stuff. And, that kind of makes that simpler. But then it's moving into sprints and moving into, just kind of getting things done, and assessing with the client. What's important to kind of recognize there is that it always starts before the engagement. We don't need this to be in a developer's hands and say, just figure it out. Whenever we do that, I've got these little hairs and they raise on the back of my head and it's horrible. We're able to get away from all of that because we, can handle it at multiple levels and allow it to make its way down the stream.
But how do you capture requirements like, if you send a query to the external system and it times out, then you need to take this step or you need to respond?
It gets documented in the wiki.
Mm-hmm.
It gets explained, in user stories for how it's going to behave, and written out in sprints and built out. So we would capture that information in our wiki, and if you're interested, stop by the Trellon booth, and I'll show you how we document.
All right. Thank you.
Hi, I don't recall if you mentioned earlier in your presentation, but are any of you Scrum certified, say, for instance, with the Scrum Master Alliance, and do you see a value in that training?
Yeah, I see a lot of value in it. Trellon's been around for 10 years, and people really like to poach our employees. And so every time I get somebody's certification, they're gone. What I try to do is sort of be the trainer and lead people in a certain direction and then push them towards getting it. People seeking certification tend to pick up, a lot of professional credits just by virtue of their role. There's a certain number of hours you need to be a certified Scrum Master. And so usually over the course of a year, you get, X percent of those, and just by being a project manager. But I don't make it a requirement in what we do. It's not just that, this kind of like fear of poaching. It's just that I think Agile evolves, and I don't know if people recognize that. Yeah. They think Scrum is there and it just works a certain way. But to be real honest with you, there are technologies that emerge all the time that automate parts of this, that make certain questions easier to answer, and experience plays a huge role in it too. Knowing who the people you're talking to has a huge, impact on the perception around what's required in terms of effort. Have we done this before? And from that perspective, I think certification has a role. Other organizations overvalue it, and we kind of see it as one of sort of a spectrum of things people could bring.
Thank you.
Cool.
I was just curious if you all tasked out your user stories, or are they just a user story?
No, but we think about it.
Okay. And why do you not? Because how do you know where the developer is in that particular user story? And like you said, if they don't finish it, would you not want to split the story so they got credit for some of the work, and then the rest of the credit could be applied to the next sprint?
Well, a user story becomes a task, okay? Like at that level, we will take it, we will paste it into our task management system, and it will be there. It's just that the idea of tasking out implies like there's a certain developer that's going to get it, right? And the truth is we've got 3 or 4 developers assigned to any project. They're working through a series of sprints. When people come to deal with Trellon, they're paying for a series of sprints. That's kind of like how we calculate what we're going to do. And it's just we never have it in our minds like, hey, so-and-so is perfect for this. Let's have him do it. What it is we write the things, we figure out who on the team can do this, and then, sometimes we just invest in our guys. Like, you're going to need some time to figure out how to build this thing, and so we'll push them in that direction. But it's a little less task-oriented than what it might seem.
Okay.
I remembered. If you've got someone that wants sprints longer than 2 weeks, have you ever had a client that's had that? Like they said, they wanted to say, we want to do a 3-week or a 4-week because we've just got a lot of stuff. Do you force them to break it apart?
No, I just tell them it's a horrible idea.
I'm sorry?
I just tell them it's a horrible idea to try and go further than that. And then I suggest that we do, and they usually do.
Thank you.
So, any other questions?
The sprint does include a review, where the day before we say pencils down, as I like to say, and then that next day is when I do the review with the client. That following, what we generally like to plan on Mondays, is sort of the back grooming for the log to see what we'd like to now include in that next sprint. And then that Tuesday is generally when we do a kickoff meeting, and we kind of run that same sort of cycle again and again. So the review. Well, it's part of the review, right? I think you're asking how do I know if it's accepted or not, or when to remove it from the backlog. That's part of the review process, which happens at the end of every sprint. I sit in front of the client, we share a screen, we look at the user story, then I go through what they've done, and then they tell me, yes, I like that, or, oh, can we just do this? Then I go, okay, it's going to go back into the backlog, and then we decide if we want to add it in to complete it that next week, or do we want to move on maybe to a different saga It's not necessarily like 100% complete, right? But it's almost there. But we have to have a process. If we don't have a process, we can't point to it when things go wrong. It's part of the reason.
I think we're over in terms of time, so we're going to break off. But if anyone wants to stop by the Trellin booth, we have these nice keychains and stickers and all kinds of other stuff. And that could be your treat for waiting until the end. Thanks so much.